quiet welcome drifts across the dark like a small tide. A presence, more atmosphere than person, invites listeners wherever they are, wrapped in a blanket, beside a shaded window, under an open sky, and hopes they are warm and comfortable, ready to wander into the slow question of whether legends of floods may be memories of real events. The voice watches the planet think with water. Snow loosens to rill, rill to stream, stream to river, river to estuary, estuary to sea. Gravity gathers what the sky has written and delivers it to the edge, where salt receives and keeps it. People settle along these edges not from forgetfulness but from logic, because silt is generous, fish return with the seasons, and transport moves easily on level water. Floodplains feed orchards and fields, and in return they sometimes overrun them. Here memory accretes like driftwood caught in reeds, piece by piece. A quiet, sturdy fact anchors the thought. Since the cold maximum of the last glacial time, global sea level rises by more than 100 meters as continental ice retreats. Continental shelves drown, beaches step landward, coral reefs climb toward light, leaving fossil terraces like stair marks on island flanks. The rise is uneven. In intervals, geologists call meltwater pulses. The ocean lifts faster, as if a frozen lung exhales in a single long breath. The evidence for these movements rests in many quiet witnesses. Oxygen isotope ratios in ice cores, and in cave stalagmites that thicken drip by drip. Foraminifera shells lifted from peat and marsh that tell where the water turned brackish. Radiocarbon-dated coral heads stranded in air like paused clocks. Drowned river valleys now drawn as estuaries on nautical charts. Each line points to the same long ascent of the sea, not in rumor but in measure, and together they sketch the pace at which shorelines step inward. A lesser detail hides in still lakes that turn seasons into handwriting. Each year summer spreads a pale, silt-rich layer. Winter lays a darker, finer band. These paired pages, varves, stack patiently, and a single flood can appear as a widened stripe, a bold line in an otherwise regular script. A patient eye counts back through them and touches the year when a river left its banks farther than usual. The quiet also collects in drowned forests, exposed at rare low tides. Black stumps on clean sand, rings tight from restrained growth, a timetable written in wood. Between sediments and stories stands a question that resists haste. How long can people remember precise changes in their landscapes? A headland that once overlooks a hunting ground may later watch over waves. A river may swing a few kilometers and leave a village inland and thirsty. A tidal channel may open where there was meadow. Can such transformations persist within oral traditions, after the edits of ritual and migration and metaphor, and remain recognizable to distant descendants? Anthropologists document the longevity of place-based narratives. Linguists trace stable formulas that help stories travel. Archaeologists uncover house floors below beach sand and hearths inside sediments that were once dry. Yet none of these lines translates a legend directly. Each only suggests how memory might last. An academic hypothesis rests lightly here. Some researchers propose that a portion of the world's flood legends encode observations of post-glacial sea level rise, river avulsion across floodplain fans, or abrupt lake outbursts, and that these observations travel as narratives shaped into directions, warnings, or cosmologies rather than measurements. In this view, a remembered forest swallowed by a new sea, or a path that now ends in water, could trace back to early Holocene change. The idea remains uncertain because dates drift in oral tradition, events overlap, and the same shoreline can move for several different reasons. The voice listens to how rivers resemble the sky. A mature meander curls like the arm of a cloud cyclone. A braided channel resembles cirrus combed by wind. The physics agree. Fluids seek easy paths, conserve momentum, and shed energy in repeating patterns across scales. The resemblance is not decorative, it is kinship. In both places, small instabilities grow and settle, and the resulting line carries the memory of the last bend. The voice gathers a quieter set of images and lets them settle. A line of oyster shells stands halfway up a cave mouth, a former shoreline lifted by the slow rebound of crust after ice. Tree rings hold scars where floodwaters drowned cambium for a week and then withdrew. Fish bones lie in hearth ash hundreds of kilometers inland because a river once traveled farther and fatter in spring. A salt meadow hides a bright lens of sand beneath its roots, a storm's single visit preserved like breath caught in glass. None of these images is a story by itself. Together, they suggest how water keeps notes. The mystery remains in cadence. Did any inundation arrive quickly enough? The breaking of a barrier, the failure of an ice dam, the rush of a storm surge up a narrowing bay that a witness could fix a before and an after and carry that hinge through generations? Or did most changes come like the movement of shadow, day after day, too slow to name? So each generation shifted houses and fields a little upslope and called the movement ordinary. The record allows both. Outburst floods can move boulders and redraw valleys, floodplains, and coasts within the span of human lives. Slow transgression can drown a coastal plain so gently that farms simply migrate as if following a receding horizon. The voice follows a final analogy with care. A basin fills the way a chest fills with breath. When climate warms and ice withdraws, the ocean inhales into available space. Marshes take new positions. Deltas grow and then surrender their edges. Barrier islands migrate like slow animals finding comfort. When winds and currents change, when cool years linger, the ocean exhales a little. Beaches widen, shorelines pause. People build and farm along this breathing edge because life concentrates there. The voice returns to the starting gesture, welcoming without claim, and lets the forms sit together. Corals stepping landward as terraces, varves counting floods in thin summer light, drowned valleys opening as estuaries, and narratives carrying a remembered edge. It does not force them to agree, it lets them touch. The planet holds long receipts in stone and salt, and cultures keep theirs in language. Between them stretches a possibility that will be examined gently in the night's remaining pages, that some legends hold the shape of real water. Ice withdraws in slow ceremony, and water advances with patient certainty. The great white continents of the north and south loosen their grip, grain by grain, until whole lobes lean and thin and step back into their own melt. The planet's light shifts across new surfaces, fresh silt, slick till, green water, and the old brightness of snow becomes the new brightness of a low sun striking wet stone. The voice observes this recession without urgency. It sees a map that changes not with borders but with density. Hard ice yields to soft water. Hard silence yields to the murmuring of streams. A fact sits in the foreground like a grounded berg. When the last glacial maximum eases, the Laurentide and Fennoscandian ice sheets diminish, and global mean sea level climbs by more than 100 meters from its lowest stand to the calmer heights of the mid-Holocene. The ascent is not smooth. Within the long climb occur abrupt steps, brief geologically when edges fail and margins carve in flurries, and the ocean's surface quickens upward. One of these steps, dated to roughly 14,600 years before present, leaves corals and marshes speaking in unison. A rapid several-meter rise compressed into a handful of centuries, a stair mark in the water's memory rather than a slope. The voice does not reprove the speed. It simply notes the capacity of ice to organize its own end. On ground newly freed, water rehearses old patterns in new places. Proglacial lakes gather along the lips of retreating domes, pale and opaline with rock flour, and then test their thresholds with seasonal patience. Rivers unbraid and braid again across fresh outwash, laying fans that look, from the air, like the ribs of a great leaf. Eskers lift like frozen serpents through spruce and birch, where tunnels once ran beneath ice. Drumlins point, quiet arrows, toward the direction of the last flow. Where the front wavers, Jokulharp's glacial outburst floods charge down valley and then end as quickly as a breath let go. The voice lingers on the aftermath. Giant ripples pressed into gravel, stranded boulders that seem deliberate in their loneliness, cataract-scarred bedrock now dry and warm to lichens. A lesser-known detail sits on a limestone shore and measures time. On certain Mediterranean coasts, colonies of vermeted sea snails and encrusting algae build narrow, wave-washed rims, bioconcreted gutters, exactly at the intertidal zone. These living ledges grow and die with sea level, leaving fossil rings along cliffs like delicate tide lines set in stone. Centuries later, a fingertip can trace these notches and, without numbers, feel where the sea once paused. Elsewhere, tidal notches gnawed by boring bivalves darken rock faces at ankle height above today's splash. In karst bays, beach rock cements old shorelines and catches footprints, tool marks, and drift impressions in a hardened film. Quietly, the ocean signs its drafts. The uncertainty arrives with equal gentleness. How much of that rapid rise near 14.6 thousand years comes from the north, and how much from the far south? Coral records in the tropical oceans register the water's height, but not the source of the melt. Models of Earth's elastic crust suggest patterns of regional uplift and subsidence that can hint, but never prove. Ice core chemistries and sediment layers tell of climate shifts, but not their exact architect. If the Laurentide contributes more, its lakes and margins must let go in concert. If Antarctica contributes more, its marine-based shelves must retreat swiftly along grounding lines. The voice sets down these possibilities like stones and does not choose among them. An academic hypothesis walks quietly beside the uncertainty. Some glaciologists propose that the largest share of that rapid ascent originates in West Antarctica, where basins grounded below sea level yield quickly, once warm water nibbles at their underbellies. Others argue for a northern drama, a partial collapse of Laurentide margins, coupled with sudden drainage from vast proglacial lakes through newly opened outlets. A third school suggests a mixed choreography, both poles moving together, their contributions overlapping in time. The evidence remains graceful but not final. Uranium-thorium ages from reef-building corals. Glacio-isostatic adjustments mapped like long echoes, and the subtle fingerprints of regional sea level patterns that should, in theory, differ depending on where the melt comes from. The voice allows the debate to continue in the background, like wind across two different grasses. Land, freed from load, rises. This isostatic rebound lifts old beaches out of reach of waves and tilts lakes so that one end grows marshy while the other deepens. Farther from former ice, a forebulge slowly sinks, and relative sea level there rises a little faster than the global mean. The result is a patchwork of histories. One harbour records a steady climb, another shows a temporary fall, a third wavers like a needle finding its standard. Archaeological horizons follow suit. A shoreline camp, once suited to shellfish, becomes a hillside lookout in the time it takes for 3 or 4 generations to stack their pottery shards. A salt marsh marches landward in little leaps across abandoned fields, leaving drowned fence posts to soften back into tannins. In the open ocean, ice-rafted debris drifts and drops as bergs discharge their loads and roll themselves thinner. A single cobble lands on fine mud 1,000 meters down and becomes a drop stone, an inverted exclamation that the cold once reached farther. In mountain ranges, cirques and tarns collect sky. Moraines shade baby forests. Polish shines on bedrock like a memory of pressure. In high-latitude summers, meltwater hums through blue moulins, vanishes, and returns miles away as a sudden, cold swell, where a glacier's face answers the sea with its own rhythm of fracture. A quiet mystery tucks itself into human scale. Do communities living near these edges sense the difference between a shore that rises because land lifts and a shore that rises because water does? From within a lifetime, the effects mingle. The benchmark is a door lintel white with salt bloom, a boat ramp that needs an extra plank, a sacred stone that stands a little deeper or drier each generation. Languages make room for such drift. Words for newly shallow channels, for the path that is passable only at the equinox tides, for the beach where the smooth stones now end. The voice collects these imagined lexicons without possessing them. Some places experience not only rise but rearrangement. Large rivers, heavy with sediment flushed from deglaciating slopes, push their mouths outward into the coastal ocean until storm seasons and sea level climb reclaim the deltas in narrow bites. Barrier islands migrate, rolling over themselves landward, their sand bodies like great, slow creatures following comfort. Lagoons behind them freshen, then salt, then fresh again as inlets cut and close. Salt-tolerant grasses pioneer in thin, glaucous lines. Burrowing crabs stitch hieroglyphs into the new mud. The world does not restore a single shape. It explores a family of forms and keeps the ones that fit. The voice allows a modest analogy. A glass cools after hot water is poured into it, and its shape does not change. Yet within it, tiny tensions rearrange. Earth behaves differently, softer and wider, but the spirit rhymes. Remove weight from a crust, and it answers with motion. Add water to its basins, and gravity distributes the load with a logic that sometimes surprises. Coastlines, estuaries, reefs, and river mouths become instruments that ring at different pitches, depending on how and where the pressure changes. In shelves now overtaken by light, corals climb toward the surface on the scaffolding of earlier heads, building terraces that remember former depth. Some reefs fail to keep pace, and their skeletons remain below, pale staircases where parrotfish graze and night octopus curl. Mangroves wade into warm shallows behind them, their roots bristling like dark eyelashes that trap silt and build soil in the shelter of the trees. In colder latitudes, kelp forests unfurl along new rocky bases, softening swell and inviting fish to take up residence in their vertical shade. Without proclamation, ecosystems follow the moving contour. Through all of it, the voice keeps the temperature even. Ice thins, water thickens, land rises, tides test new edges. Evidence piles slowly and beautifully. Coral heads with dates inside their carbonate, tidal notches set like measured breaths in stone, drop stones embedded like punctuation in deep mud, shorelines canted by the rebound of a relieved crust. The meaning remains gentle. Ice withdraws and water advances, and in the changing distance between them, cultures set their homes and their stories, not as fiction, but as the local way of saying that the world moves. He turns to the inland sea that is almost a lake, circled by cliffs and steps and cities, where a narrow strait is both the throat and the memory. The Black Sea lies dark, layered, and quiet. Above, a thin, oxygenated skin breathes with rivers and wind, and below, dense water rests in stillness, cradling sulfidic depths that keep wood and rope like time folded in salt. Two-layer flow moves through the Bosporus brackish surface waters, escape toward the Marmara. The heavier Mediterranean water slips inward beneath, establishing a strong halocline that fixes the deep anoxia for which this basin is known. The sill that governs this exchange sits only a few dozen meters below modern sea level, a low stone gate that has opened and closed across the late Quaternary, like a hinge with a long memory. Ocean, Washington, Edu, ResearchGate. He listens to the debate that lingers at this threshold. One proposal, carried into public imagination in the late 1992, suggests that around 7,600 years ago, some argue closer to 400-inch calibrated years, the rising Mediterranean overtops the sill and rushes through the Bosporus, converting a lower, fresher lake into the modern sea within a human lifetime. In this telling, shorelines leap landward, beaches drown, and people who live with reeds at their ankles wake one season to salt at their door lintels. Another view pictures a progressive reconnection. Outflow first from Black Sea to Marmara, while global sea level is still lower. Then a period of two-way exchange as the outside ocean rises, and eventually the modern pattern, an advance not as sudden as a shout, but as steady as breath. The argument rests on cores and terraces, on microfossils and drowned shorelines, and on the geometry of the sill itself. Ancient ports antique. Com. Archimer.iframer.fr. Agupubs. Online library. Wiley. Com. A clear process, whatever the tempo, follows from physics. As the Mediterranean climbs with the global ocean, it approaches the Bosporus sill, now generally measured around 32-34 meters below present sea level, and begins to ease seawater into the basin whenever the outside surface stands higher than the inside. At the same time, rivers like the Danube, Dniester, Dnieper, and Don freshen the surface and push their lighter lens outward. The result is a permanent stratification. This density structure suppresses mixing, and the deep layer, rich in remineralized nutrients and sulfide, goes anoxic and remains so, an engine for preserving organic matter on the bottom. The modern two-layer exchange is unambiguous. The question is how quickly that exchange began. ResearchGate, Ocean, Washington, Edu. He holds in mind a lesser-known field sign on the seafloor just south of the strait, a submerged delta in the Sea of Marmara, built not by a river but by the outflowing Black Sea itself. When the basin stood high relative to the outside, and light water spilled seaward across the sill. Seismic profiles and seabed imaging trace this wedge. It implies a time when the Black Sea exports its surface waters, before later stages bring stronger inward flow at depth. Like a shadow of direction kept in sand, this geomorphic signature softens claims of a single, abrupt reversal. Agupubs. Online library. Wiley. Com. A quiet uncertainty enters with the dating of waters and shells. In semi-closed seas, carbon in dissolved inorganic form can be old relative to the air, so organisms that build with it inherit an apparent age. Reservoir effects vary by basin and time and must be corrected carefully. In the Black Sea and Mediterranean, measured reservoir ages of several hundred years complicate radiocarbon chronologies for the very interval when the reconnection unfolds. Scholars work to refine these offsets and to agree on which archives record local age and which capture the global curve. The story remains precise in method and provisional in numbers, a balance that suits the topic. Cambridge University, Press and Assessment. Agupubs. Online library. Wiley. Com. He lets the physical evidence gather in a slow arc. Offshore of Turkey and Bulgaria, drowned beach ridges, shore parallel dunes, and terrace fragments lie in water, tens of meters deep, like delicate handwriting smudged but legible. Some cores show a shift from fresh water to marine microfauna diatoms, foraminifera, ostracods, suggesting salinization of the upper layer over time. One team reads that signature as a prompt transgression that salinizes gradually. Another reads it as a series of oscillations and creeping advances. In the Danube Delta, stratigraphic sequences and radiocarbon ages sketch a story of rising water that is significant but not sudden enough to redraw channels and marshes and to retire some lowlands, not enough to erase the map in a day. SERP, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. He pauses with a detail that feels hand-sized. In 2000, an expedition working off the Turkish coast documents timber remains and shore-like features at about 9,100 meters depth, along with freshwater shells at levels below the modern sea. The Black Sea's deep anoxia, with its lack of wood-boring organisms, keeps such materials intact in a way rare elsewhere. A mast can stand as if in air. These pieces do not solve the argument, but they lend texture to memory. People are here when the edges move. News, Garn, Edu, National Geographic. The mystery stays soft rather than sharp. If the reconnection is swift, if the outside sea overleaps the gate, and the inner basin rises by tens of meters within a century or two, then the moment offers edges a person can name, a spring in which the shoreline does not return, a freshwater fish that grows scarce, a well that turns brackish, a path that fails. If the reconnection is progressive, stories change line by line across generations, a jetty extended each decade, a reed bed that marches shoreward, a beach that becomes a bar, a field that sours in dry summers. Oral histories can contain both types of change, but they favor the memorable hinge. The Black Sea leaves traces of each possibility, and the voices that live around it could have carried either signal. Science direct, a restrained hypothesis enters, academic and uncertain. Some archaeologists suggest that if there was a marked threshold, whether a fast salinization, a punctuated rise, or a sudden opening of the gate, villages on low shelves could have been abandoned, and their people dispersed along river corridors. Such movements might have braided into the wider spread of Neolithic practices and, over centuries, found echo in stories that remember water taking land. Others argue that agriculture and exchange already knit those landscapes, and that settlements adapt to transgression with incremental shifts rather than flights. In their reading, later legends borrow the universal image of flood to carry moral and cosmological weight, not eyewitness memory. Neither claim rests satisfied. Both remain proposals shaped to fit fragmentary ground. Science direct. He returns to the strait itself, not as a theatre of drama, but as a patient device. Bedrock at the Bosporus runs far deeper than the modern sill. Sediment and shifting hydraulics set the present lip. In glacial lowstands, the Black Sea can behave as an oversized lake and may even spill outward. In interglacials, the world ocean presses back. The system swings between these modes repeatedly through the Quaternary. So the early Holocene question is not whether a connection forms, but how. The sill's modest depth means small differences in regional sea level translate into sharp differences in flow and direction. A reason the debate endures in details rather than in kind. Science direct. He allows a gentle analogy. The exchange between basins resembles a doorway between two rooms at slightly different air pressures. A thin draft near the floor flows one way, a warmer draft near the ceiling flows the other, and the house records both by the way curtains stir. Replace air with water and curtains with layers of plankton, bacteria, and silt, and the image fits enough to instruct without pretending to prove. In that doorway, time collects shells that taste of rivers shifting to shells that taste of salt, a chemocline rising and falling with seasons, and an ancient gate that opens and narrows and opens again. He leaves the scene without verdict. The Black Sea's quiet transformation is real. Its pace is measured differently by different instruments. The shoreline moves, the deep stays breathless, the strait keeps its own counsel. Legends of floods need not be born here to find nourishment in such a place, but if some are, they would carry the contours of this basin's memory. A low sill, a layered sea, and people who learn to live by water that changes its mind. The voice drifts outward from the enclosed basin of the Black Sea into the wide stage of the global ocean. Here the water remembers its sudden pulses, events where the long climb of sea level pauses in gentleness and then surges forward in sharp ascent. These intervals are not constant rhythms but spasms, recorded as terraces of coral, as stranded marshes, as anomalies in isotope curves, as the buried margins of once dry plains. They are called meltwater pulses, and they arrive like planetary heartbeats, rare, abrupt, and consequential. A factual center holds the image steady. Around 14,600 years before present, evidence from coral reefs near Tahiti and Barbados, as well as from marine sediment cores, signals a rapid rise in sea level of several meters, compressed into less than 5 centuries. Geologists call it meltwater pulse, 1 ampere. Later, near 11,300 years ago, another surge, known as meltwater pulse, 1b, may have lifted oceans by several meters again, though its pace and magnitude remain contested. Together, these pulses stitch across the early Holocene like bold marks, sharper than the surrounding slope of the deglacial climb. They tell of ice sheets losing equilibrium, of margins collapsing, of gates that hold then fail, and of oceans quickened by sudden inheritance. The landscapes at those moments shift profoundly. Broad coastal plains drown into estuaries. River mouths retreat inland and recombine with lagoons. Barrier islands roll back across their own skeletons. For people living at edges, these changes compress centuries of gradual movement into the span of their lives. A fishing ground vanishes. A camp's hearth ends beneath salt. A field goes sour before children inherit it, whether remembered as sudden deluge or as a season that never returned to its usual shoreline. The change leaves a mark. Yet the geological record alone cannot fix how fast the waves overtook homes, only that they did. A poetic detail rests in Pacific coral staircases. Coral polyps build upward toward the light. But when sea level rises too quickly, their skeletons fall behind. The reef becomes a drowned terrace, a fossil plateau where living heads once stood. Divers moving down those steps feel with their fingers the pauses and the leaps. Each notch is both a measure and a failure. The reef could not keep pace, so it froze in stone what the ocean accomplished in water. The mystery lies in sources. From where does the extra water arrive? Oxygen isotopes in ice cores and the geometry of uplifted shorelines hint at patterns, but the precise distribution remains elusive. Some models emphasize the Laurentide ice sheet in North America, draining great proglacial lakes in cataclysmic pulses. Others emphasize the Antarctic ice shelves, where basins grounded below sea level yield quickly once destabilized. Still others imagine a choreography in which both hemispheres contribute, their surges overlapping to create the observed global signal. The truth likely bends across these versions, and the ocean remembers all without distinguishing. One hypothesis, discussed in calm rooms of science, proposes that the main driver of meltwater pulse, 1 ampere, is Antarctic in origin. West Antarctic basins, grounded on bedrock far below sea level, may have retreated rapidly when circumpolar waters warmed and flowed beneath their margins. Evidence for this lies in the fingerprint pattern of sea level rise, how certain regions record more than the global average, while others record less, depending on the redistribution of Earth's gravity and crustal adjustment after ice loss. In some reconstructions, that pattern fits best if the South supplied the larger share. Another school, equally careful, attributes much of the water to Laurentide collapse, particularly the drainage of proglacial Lake Agassiz-Ojibwe into the North Atlantic, which may have disrupted circulation and cooled climate in a chain of effects. Both positions remain hypotheses, each supported by some records and strained by others, each awaiting better resolution. The voice follows water leaving its frozen prison. Imagine ice sheets perched on landscapes thousands of kilometers across, their weight pressing Earth's crust downward. As margins thin, meltwater gathers in vast lakes, sometimes held only by ice dams. When such a dam weakens, an outburst can send torrents across plains, carving spillways, scattering boulders, and discharging into the ocean with a volume greater than any modern river. In North America, channels like the Mackenzie, the St. Lawrence, and Hudson Bay each record such floods. In Siberia, the Ob and Yenisei show traces as well. These floods do not simply raise the ocean. They alter salinity and currents, sometimes weakening the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which in turn reshapes climate. Thus, a pulse of meltwater may echo not only in sea level but in wind and rain, in forests and deserts far from the melt's origin. A quieter sign is stored in speleothems stalagmites that grow in caves drop by drop. Their oxygen isotopes register the moisture balance of the region above. Around the times of meltwater pulses, some caves show sudden shifts, reflecting monsoon systems altered by fresh water, reaching the ocean and slowing currents that once carried warmth. In this way, a small stalagmite under a limestone ridge can record the trembling of great ice sheets thousands of kilometers away. The planet's systems converse in long circuits, and stone keeps the minutes. Another detail rests in the Andes, where glacial lakes form behind moraines and ice dams. Sometimes these fail in abrupt jokulhalps, sending walls of water down valleys. Though smaller in scale than ocean-affecting pulses, they mirror the process on a regional canvas. Sudden release, catastrophic reshaping, and then calm. Local oral traditions in highland cultures describe lakes that burst, valleys scoured, and villages lost reminders that meltwater pulses come in sizes both global and local, each leaving its memory in rock and story. The mystery extends into human time. Archaeological horizons near coasts often truncate around these intervals. Shell middens sink below marine sediments. Campsites once at river mouths lie drowned in estuaries. Some argue that such shifts pressed communities inland or forced innovations in subsistence. Yet others note continuity evidence that people adjusted gradually, relocating as the waters encroached. Which interpretation holds may depend on whether a particular shoreline experienced a dramatic pulse or a slow advance. Legends of sudden floods might crystallize in areas where the rise felt abrupt, while elsewhere the story becomes one of steady migration, scarcely mythic at all. An academic hypothesis reaches across mythologies. Scholars have suggested that some flood legends, whether in Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean, or the Pacific, may encode memories of meltwater pulses. A sudden rise of tens of meters within a few centuries could plausibly inspire tales of a deluge covering all lands. Yet the correlation is uncertain, for myths conflate many waters. Seasonal floods, storm surges, river avulsions, and cosmological seas. Meltwater pulses offer a geological candidate for some of these motifs, but they cannot be assumed as the sole origin. Oral tradition and geology intersect here, not as mirror images, but as overlapping waves. The voice returns to imagery of the sea itself. When the ocean surface rises quickly, shorelines respond in intricate patterns. Tidal prisms expand, estuarine salinity gradients shift, marsh plants climb landward, deltas retreat. Even groundwater responds, with aquifers recharged or invaded by salt. The changes ripple outward like concentric rings. To live at a shoreline during such a pulse would be to witness the redefinition of every familiar boundary between fresh and salt, dry and wet, land and sea. A gentle analogy helps the mind follow. The ocean's climb resembles a staircase in which most steps are shallow, but here and there, a riser is tall. Walking such stairs requires a sudden lift of the leg, an effort that stands out in memory. So it is with meltwater pulses. They punctuate the long ascent with movements that strain adaptation, movements that might be remembered in story long after. The evidence remains distributed across coral reefs, marsh cores, ice sheets, and submerged landscapes. It requires synthesis rather than certainty. Still, the existence of rapid sea level rise is secure, and the knowledge that humanity lived through them is also sure. Whether these rises appear in legend as deluges or in archaeology as absences, they belong to the texture of early human experience. The voice quiets to rest. Meltwater pulses remind that Earth breathes unevenly, sometimes exhaling in long sighs, sometimes in sudden gusts. The ocean carries both in its level. Shorelines receive both in their migrations. People learn to read both, whether in the mud of rivers or the rhythm of stories. The pulse is part of the whole song, sharp, but still within the larger drift. The voice turns now toward a dry region, where two great rivers carve through dust and desert, a landscape that has known both famine and fertility. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, lies wide and flat, built of silt, carried from mountains far away. Here, water is not only a resource, but the very condition of civilization. The rivers flood, as rivers do, and then they retreat, leaving behind alluvium dark and soft, ready for seed. In this cycle lie the origins of agriculture, of cities, of written words, and of legends in which floodwaters cover the land entire. A fact steadies the scene. Seasonal floods of the Tigris and Euphrates are driven by snowmelt in the Zagros and Taurus mountains, reaching their peaks in spring. Archaeological and geological studies show that these floods were not only annual, but sometimes catastrophic, when unusual rainfall combined with melt to swell the rivers beyond ordinary bounds. The flat topography of southern Mesopotamia amplifies such overflows. A modest rise in water stage can spread across kilometers of plain, drowning fields, houses, and temples alike. Sediment cores near ancient settlements preserve layers of flood-borne clay and silt, sandwiched between occupation levels, evidence that communities endured, rebuilt, and remembered. A poetic detail emerges in the written record. The earliest cuneiform tablets often mention grain, barley rations, and irrigation canals. These signs, pressed into wet clay, are born of water management, of counting grain that grew because floods refreshed the fields, of calculating dike repairs after inundation. In this way, the world's first writing systems can be traced to the cycles of rivers. Clay, once deposited by floods, becomes the surface upon which floods are recorded as symbols. The story of water is embedded not only in soil, but in script itself. Uncertainty threads through the archaeological layers. In sites such as Shuruppak, Kish, and distinct flood deposits are found, some a meter thick, some thinner. Scholars debate whether these represent single catastrophic events or the cumulative effect of repeated floods. The radiocarbon dates do not align perfectly, nor do the thicknesses match across sites. One layer might signal a citywide inundation, another could be a local flood confined to a low-lying district. The record leaves ambiguity, and legends woven centuries later may condense multiple episodes into a single remembered deluge. An academic hypothesis, considered with care, suggests that Mesopotamian flood myths, such as those in the Sumerian king list, and later, epics, may derive from actual river floods that disrupted early urban life. A city inundated beyond recovery would leave survivors to scatter, carrying memories that coalesce into narrative. When retold across generations, a single destructive event might become the flood that reset history, after which kingship was said to descend anew from heaven. Yet others caution that the myths need not refer to a literal flood, but rather use flood as a cosmic metaphor for chaos, with deep waters symbolizing the unformed void against which order must be renewed. Both readings remain possible, neither exclusive of the other. The rivers themselves carry mysteries. The Tigris and Euphrates shift course frequently, avulsing across their wide floodplain. Channels that once fed a city's harbor can dry as the river swings kilometers away, while new channels carve through cultivated fields. Archaeological surveys reveal abandoned riverbeds like scars across the plain, each once full of water and traffic. For ancient communities, such changes might feel as disorienting as a flood, for they alter the relationship between land and water overnight. A harbor may be left stranded inland, forcing migration or adaptation. Did these shifts, too, enter the stock of stories remembered as floods? The voice lingers on the paradox of abundance and danger. Floods renew the land by delivering fertile silt, but they also destroy homes and crops. Irrigation channels, carefully cut to distribute water, can turn into pathways of ruin when the rivers rise beyond their banks. Ancient texts describe kings boasting of canal building, of restraining or guiding the floods, yet also hymns that speak of waters overwhelming all. This ambivalence water, as both giver and taker, pervades the cultural memory of Mesopotamia. A small but telling detail lies in the sediments of the Persian Gulf. Core samples reveal that during the Holocene, the Gulf gradually filled with river-borne silt, extending the delta outward. Villages that once sat by the shore now lie dozens of kilometers inland. For ancient people, the Gulf itself would have seemed to retreat, even as the rivers periodically advanced. Stories might preserve such shifts in perspective: land reclaimed, then lost again. The uncertainty of timing continues. Geological reconstructions suggest that sea level rise and river flooding may have intersected in southern Mesopotamia around 6,000 years ago. As post-glacial seas stabilized, the Gulf's shoreline lay farther inland. The combined influence of rising sea and swelling rivers could have produced large-scale inundations beyond ordinary floods. Whether such episodes correspond to remembered myths cannot be proved, yet the coincidence tempts speculation. An academic hypothesis offered by some scholars proposes that the flood layer found in certain Mesopotamian tells is linked not to ordinary floods, but to larger hydrological events, perhaps even extraordinary storms or regional shifts in Numan rainfall patterns during the mid-Holocene. If a period of intensified precipitation overwhelmed river systems, it could explain widespread flood deposits. Others argue for purely local processes. As in many aspects of deep history, the evidence resists a single interpretation. The voice widens to consider cultural continuity. Floods not only shaped fields and stories, but also rituals. The Akitu festival, marking the new year in Babylon, invoked creation myths in which the sea goddess Tiamat embodied chaos subdued by order. This imagery of water overwhelming and order re-established echoes the physical rhythm of river floods, which erase boundaries only to recede and allow planting once more. In ritual, the cosmic flood recurs annually, controlled through ceremony just as canals controlled the real waters. A gentle analogy arises. Floodplains behave like breathing lungs, expanding with water in flood season, contracting in drought. Cities built upon them live with this respiration. When the inhale is modest, crops flourish. When too great, houses drown. Ancient Mesopotamians, observing this rhythm, may have seen their entire world as pulsing with the breath of rivers. In such a rhythm, myth and fact are not separable, they are two registers of the same oscillation. The voice returns to the archaeological layers, where clay tablets, broken jars, and foundations lie embedded in flood silt. Each flood is both an interruption and a renewal. Communities rebuild, perhaps on higher ground, perhaps with stronger dikes. Yet they never abandon the floodplain entirely, for the benefits outweigh the dangers. This decision to remain in harm's way for the sake of fertility is itself a profound continuity, visible in river civilizations across the world. Legends of waters covering all land may thus be understood as amplifications of lived reality. For Mesopotamians, floods were not distant threats but annual certainties, sometimes gentle, sometimes devastating. To imagine one flood greater than all others, sweeping across the whole land, was not fanciful. It was the logical extension of what they already knew. Whether inspired by a specific catastrophic flood or by the cumulative memory of many, the myth arises from conditions that made such a story both plausible and powerful. The voice grows quiet again, letting the image rest. Twin rivers coursing through dust, swelling each spring, sometimes rising too high. Silt lays its fine handwriting across the plain. Reeds grow thick where channels shift. Clay becomes both the medium of record and the substance of disaster. In this place, floodwaters are not strangers, but kin, shaping the very forms of life and language. Myths of deluge are natural companions to such a landscape, not as invention, but as deep memory. folded into story the way silt is folded into soil. The voice drifts from the river plains to clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks, their surfaces cracked by time yet still legible. These tablets carry one of the world's oldest flood stories, the tale of Ziusudra, later echoed in the Akkadian Atrahasis, and still later in the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh. Each version describes a chosen man warned of a coming flood, instructed to build a vessel, to preserve life, and to endure until the waters subside. The narrative is striking not for its singularity, but for its persistence, told again and again across centuries in different tongues and empires, each generation inheriting a story already old. A factual anchor lies in the Sumerian king list, where a line of text divides rulers into two epochs, those who ruled before the flood and those who ruled after. The flood becomes a hinge in history, a reference point beyond which kingship is described as descending once more from heaven. Archaeological layers at Shuruppak, an early Sumerian city, preserve a band of flood-borne sediment dating to around 2900 BCE. Some scholars propose that this layer reflects a real inundation, perhaps from the Euphrates overflowing its banks, that could have inspired the Sumerian memory of a great flood. The correlation is not exact, but the coincidence invites reflection. A sedimentary line in the earth, a legendary line in a list of kings. A poetic detail rests in the language itself. On one Sumerian tablet, the name Ziusudra translates to life of long days, an epithet as much as a name. In the Akkadian version, Atrahasis means exceedingly wise. Each epithet connects survival with a quality of endurance, longevity, or wisdom, mirroring the role these figures play as preservers of life. The boat they build is described with careful dimensions, its walls sealed with bitumen, its interior filled with seeds, animals, and families. Such precise instructions suggest familiarity with boats used to survive real floods, expanded in story to the scale of cosmic salvation. The uncertainty rests in the relationship between these myths and actual floods. Did a catastrophic event around 2900 BCE, or at other times, inspire the narrative that later crystallized into epic form? Or did storytellers, accustomed to annual floods and occasional disasters, imagine an ultimate deluge to convey themes of renewal and divine judgment? Archaeology reveals flood deposits but not myth. Myth reveals motifs but not events. The bridge between them remains incomplete, though tantalizingly close. An academic hypothesis, proposed by some scholars, holds that Mesopotamian flood stories preserve the memory of extraordinary regional floods, whether from river avulsion, exceptional rainfall, or even seismic activity altering river channels. These events may have displaced populations, inspired oral traditions, and eventually been written down. Others argue instead for symbolic interpretation. The flood represents the cyclical destruction and renewal inherent in agricultural life. The story need not reflect a single historical event, but may condense centuries of experience into one archetypal catastrophe. Both views hold weight, and neither erases the other. The voice recalls that Mesopotamian myths are not solitary. The flood narrative in Gilgamesh resonates strongly with later accounts in Hebrew scripture, where Noah builds an ark, releases birds to find land, and restores life after the waters fall. Scholars note the shared details. A vessel sealed with pitch, animals saved 2 by 2, birds sent as scouts, a mountain where the ark comes to rest. These parallels suggest either cultural transmission along the interconnected trade routes of the ancient Near East, or convergent imagination inspired by shared experience of rivers that could swallow towns. In either case, the Mesopotamian stories stand as one of the earliest written witnesses to a theme that travels widely. A quieter sign comes from bitumen. In southern Mesopotamia, natural seeps of this sticky black substance were known and used in antiquity. Archaeological finds show bitumen applied to baskets, reed boats, and bricks, Its mention in flood stories, as the substance sealing the ark, reflects practical familiarity. Without bitumen, reed and wood vessels might fail under prolonged exposure to water. In this detail, myth aligns with engineering. The imagined ark is plausible in the world it comes from, not fantasy but scaled-up reality. The voice notes the rhythm of flood myths. Waters rise, all life seems lost. One survivor endures, the waters recede. Life begins anew. This cycle echoes agricultural rhythms. Each year, fields drown in floodwaters, old growth dies, and then new planting follows as waters retreat. Myth expands the annual cycle into a cosmic one, projecting seasonal death and rebirth onto the scale of the world. A mystery lingers in the convergence of myths across distant regions. Why do cultures separated by oceans share stories of great floods? Some suggest independent invention, for floods are common human experiences. Others suggest diffusion, the traveling of stories alongside goods and people. In Mesopotamia, the textual tradition preserves an unusually clear early witness, but similar motifs appear in India, China, Mesoamerica, and Oceania. The recurrence raises the question: are these stories echoes of specific local events or of universal psychological patterns? The voice does not answer, only lets the question rest. An academic hypothesis sometimes raised is that collective memory can persist in oral traditions far longer than once assumed centuries, even millennia, if the story is tied to place and repeated in ritual contexts. In this view, Mesopotamian flood myths may indeed preserve faint memories of extraordinary events long before they were written. Yet the durability of such memories is still debated. While some traditions demonstrably encode events thousands of years old, others change rapidly, absorbing new influences and discarding old forms. Oral memory is not fixed but alive, reshaping itself while retaining certain bones of structure. The voice lingers on a more material clue. Archaeologists working near and other sites find signs of repeated rebuilding, structures buried beneath silt and then rebuilt upon. To walk these layers is to see a city rising like a palimpsest, each generation reconstructing atop the ruins of floods. In such a landscape, it is natural to imagine a single, definitive flood, the one that surpasses all others, the one that marks the turning of ages. The myth of Ziusudra may be read as a cultural condensation of this long, layered experience of water. A gentle analogy rises. Flood stories are like levees. They channel chaotic waters into a narrative form, preventing them from dispersing into countless small recollections. Just as a levee concentrates a river into one course, the myth channels centuries of floods into one cosmic event, easier to carry, easier to remember. Through this shaping, cultural memory persists, not in precise measurements of cubits of rise or hours of inundation, but in a symbolic form that conveys the truth of vulnerability to overwhelming water. The voice softens as it considers the after. Each flood story ends not in destruction but in renewal. The survivor steps into a cleansed world, animals disembark, plants grow again, kingship resumes, the cycle restarts. This structure reassures, even the worst flood is not final. For ancient peoples, surrounded by rivers that alternately gave life and threatened death, such reassurance was necessary. Floods may be inevitable, but life returns afterward. The tablets, cracked and incomplete, carry these messages across millennia. They remind that memory is not only stored in sediments and shorelines, but also in words pressed into clay. Where science reads isotopes and stratigraphy, myth reads meaning into the same cycles. Both are forms of remembering, both truthful in their own registers. The flood of Ziusudra and Atrahasis belongs to this dual memory. Geological in origin, cultural in expression, enduring in both. The voice closes gently. Along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, floods come and go. Silt settles, crops grow, canals fill and empty, kings rule and die. And through it all, a story persists, whispered on tablets, sung in epics, retold across cultures. Once the waters covered all, and one life remained to begin again. The voice moves eastward now, across deserts and mountain ranges, into the wide floodplains and monsoon-breathing valleys of South Asia. Here the Indus River once sprawled in braided complexity, nourished by Himalayan snows and monsoon rains, feeding one of the earliest great urban civilizations. Along its shifting courses arose cities such as Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and Lothal, brick-built settlements arranged with measured precision, their streets lined with drains, their granaries planned with care. Yet beneath this order flowed the unsteady rhythms of water, floods in some years, failures in others, and always the restless pulse of the monsoon. A fact centers the meditation. The Indus Valley civilization, flourishing from around 2600 to 1900 BCE, depended on the balance of river floods and seasonal rains. Geological studies reveal that the Indus and its tributaries have repeatedly shifted channels across their alluvial fans, sometimes abandoning whole valleys to carve new paths. The monsoon system, too, is not constant but varies in strength over centuries, governed by orbital cycles and ocean currents. When the monsoon weakens, rivers dwindle. When it strengthens, floods expand. Archaeological evidence shows both extremes. Layers of flood silt covering ancient streets, and later, abandoned wells where water once flowed. A poetic detail rests in the baked bricks of Mohenjo-Daro. Many are found displaced, as if rebuilt again and again after inundations. Some lower levels of the city reveal walls tilted or eroded by water, stairways leading down to what were once streets but became channels. The Great Bath, a carefully constructed pool lined with bitumen, may symbolize not only ritual purity but also the constant relationship of these people with water, contained and controlled. Even in their most sacred space, the element that both sustained and threatened them was honored in masonry. Uncertainty lies in the reasons for the civilization's decline. Scholars debate whether changing river courses, repeated floods, or weakening monsoons played the decisive role. Some argue that tectonic shifts diverted tributaries away from Harappan centers, leaving cities stranded without water. Others emphasize catastrophic floods, such as those evidenced in Lothal, where a thick layer of silt buries workshops and warehouses. Still others see gradual climate change, centuries of reduced monsoon rains, undermining agriculture until the urban network could no longer be sustained. Each explanation carries evidence, and all may have contributed in concert. An academic hypothesis proposes that oral traditions from the Indian subcontinent, preserved in later Vedic hymns and Puranic stories, may retain faint echoes of environmental upheavals in the Indus Age. Some scholars see in the tale of Manu, warned by a fish of an impending flood and guided to safety, a memory of floods endured by earlier riverine peoples. Yet the distance in time between the Harappan world and the recording of these texts is vast. The link remains conjectural, a suggestion of how stories might preserve fragments of environmental memory without certainty. The voice attends to the rivers themselves. The Indus descends from glaciers, carrying milky water rich with silt. In summer, as the monsoon rains strike the Himalaya, torrents swell the tributaries, joining the snowmelt. The result is a double peak in discharge, one from ice, one from rain, giving the river its seasonal pulse. Floodplains spread wide, their soils renewed, but settlements along the banks must endure sudden inundation. Archaeological layers at Mohenjo-Daro reveal repeated rebuilding above flood deposits, suggesting resilience rather than abandonment. People willing to live with floods as the cost of fertility. A small detail lingers in the Harappan city of Dholavira, located on an island in the Rann of Kutch. Here, Engineers built elaborate reservoirs to capture monsoon rains, carving channels and steps into stone. These reservoirs reflect a culture deeply attuned to the variability of water. Though the Indus floods nourished distant plains, places like Dholavira depended on harnessing scarce rainfall. The contrast across the civilization, between flood control in some areas and rainwater storage in others, shows how central water was to every form of survival. The mystery deepens with the Ganga-Hakra River, often identified with the Sarasvati of ancient texts. Satellite imagery reveals a dry channel stretching across the desert, lined with Harappan sites now far from active rivers. Debate continues. Was this once a major Indus tributary, later lost to tectonic shifts, or a smaller seasonal stream magnified in cultural memory? The truth remains elusive. If a great river did flow there, its disappearance may have left a wound remembered as myth. If not, then the persistence of the story testifies to the imaginative importance of rivers even where their waters fail. An academic hypothesis considers how the variability of the South Asian monsoon may have shaped cycles of settlement. Strong monsoons might feed population growth, expanding cities across the plain. When monsoons weaken, as records from cave stalagmites in India suggest they did around 2000 BCE, rivers falter, floods diminish, and urban systems contract. The correlation between climatic shifts and the decline of Harappan cities remains debated, but it is clear that the monsoon, this vast breathing of the atmosphere, dictated the fate of the civilization more surely than kings or armies. The voice lets smaller images accumulate. Farmers leading cattle onto freshly flooded fields, planting as the water recedes. Fishermen casting nets in swollen streams, catching species that appear only during floods. Potters digging clay from silt newly deposited near their kilns. Children playing on rooftops while floodwaters swirl through lanes below. Each vignette illustrates the ambivalence of flood, dangerous yet productive, destructive yet necessary. A gentle analogy offers perspective. The monsoon is like a great inhalation and exhalation of the planet. Winds draw ocean air inland, releasing rain in torrents, then withdraw, leaving dryness behind. Cities of the Indus lived within this breath. Too shallow an inhale, and crops fail. Too deep, and rivers overwhelm their banks. Survival depended on reading this rhythm, just as farmers today still watch the monsoon's arrival with anxious eyes. The Indus floods also leave traces far downstream. The delta, one of the world's largest, has advanced and retreated repeatedly through Holocene time. Cores taken from its sediments reveal alternating layers of coarse flood deposits and fine estuarine mud. These layers are the delta's diary, recording centuries of floods too numerous for memory but perhaps distilled into stories of deluge and renewal. The voice considers again the myth of Manu, preserved in Hindu tradition. A fish warns him of an approaching flood, instructs him to build a boat, and guides him to safety tied to a horn. When the waters recede, his vessel comes to rest on a mountain, and he becomes the progenitor of humankind. The parallels with Mesopotamian flood stories are unmistakable, yet the imagery is also distinctly local. The sacred fish, the mountain of refuge, the connection between flood and cosmic renewal. Perhaps this story carries an echo of real floods in the Indus plain. Perhaps it reflects the universal human confrontation with overwhelming water. Either way, it speaks to the intertwining of environment and imagination. Archaeologists, searching the floodplains, note evidence of resilience as well as vulnerability. Even when floods buried cities, people returned, rebuilding on higher mounds. The word tell in archaeology, the mound formed by generations of rebuilding, is itself testimony to this persistence. Each layer of mud is followed by another of habitation, showing that people did not abandon the floodplain lightly. The fertility of silt outweighed the risk of inundation. This logic, repeated across continents, is why flood myths are so common. Where land is richest, danger is also greatest. The voice grows quiet with an image of water glinting under monsoon clouds, fields half submerged, and brick houses standing above the flood on raised platforms. Floods pass, crops return, and stories circulate of times when the waters rose higher than any remembered. Legends form in these moments, where survival and loss intertwine. The Indus and its monsoon breath supply both reality and metaphor, a rhythm of excess and absence that humans translate into myth. The voice shifts north and east, into another great plain built by river water and silt. Here flows the Yellow River, the Huanghe, born from glaciers and loess, twisting across northern China like a restless vein. Known as China's sorrow, it floods with such frequency and force that whole dynasties have measured their stability by their ability to contain it. Its name comes from the loess dust it carries, a fine powder swept from deserts into the river's grasp, turning the water opaque and golden. This river, heavy with earth, builds and destroys in the same breath. A factual foundation holds steady. The Yellow River has changed its course more than 1,500 times in recorded history, with at least 26 major course shifts across the last 3 millennia. Between its middle reaches and the sea, its bed rises above the surrounding land as sediment deposition elevates the channel, creating what is known as a hanging river. When levees fail, the water does not simply flood the plain, it leaps into new courses, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away, abandoning old paths and carving new ones. In 1887, one such flood killed nearly 1 million people, among the deadliest natural disasters in human history. Yet, even before written history, the same dynamics unfolded, shaping the lives and memories of ancient communities. A poetic detail comes from the river's sediment. The Loess Plateau, built over eons from wind-blown dust, gives the river its burden. When rain falls on this fine soil, it erodes easily, filling the river with silt until the water becomes thick and slow. This suspended earth gives the Yellow River its color, but also its peril. For deposition constantly raises the riverbed. The same dust that fertilizes fields also ensures that floods are inevitable. It is as if the river carries both gift and grief in the same current. Uncertainty lingers in the early accounts of floods that shaped dynastic origins. The most famous is the legend of Yu the Great, who is said to have tamed the floods by dredging channels and guiding waters to the sea, thus founding the Xia dynasty. Archaeologists debate whether this tale reflects a real catastrophic flood, such as one hypothesized around 1920 BCE, when sediment evidence at Jishi Gorge on the Yellow River suggests a massive outburst flood. If so, the legend of Yu may preserve a memory of that event, recast into political myth. If not, the story may symbolize the larger truth that rulers gain legitimacy through controlling water. The ambiguity remains, poised between geology and legend. An academic hypothesis proposes that the flood at Jishi Gorge, triggered by an earthquake-induced landslide dam that later failed, may have inspired the myth of Yu. Radiocarbon dating of driftwood and flood sediments points to a great flood around 1920 BCE, coinciding with the archaeological transition from the late Neolithic to the early Bronze Age in the region. If communities endured such a flood, its scale could easily have become foundational in memory, reinterpreted over centuries as the moment when civilization itself was reborn through hydraulic order. Yet scholars remain cautious. One flood does not prove a dynasty, and the story of Yu may represent more than a single event. The voice listens to the river's sorrow across centuries. Dynastic chronicles describe great floods as omens of cosmic imbalance, signs that rulers had lost the mandate of heaven. Floods were never only natural disasters, they were political verdicts. When the river broke its banks, it drowned not just villages, but legitimacy. Thus, myths of deluge and renewal entered governance itself, shaping history as much as ecology. A small but vivid detail appears in ancient hydrological works. Records describe peasants constructing levees of woven reeds, strengthened with earth, only to see them fail when the river rose beyond their height. Each repair made the levees higher, but each collapse carried greater devastation, for the riverbed itself climbed with sediment. By the Ming dynasty, the Yellow River ran as much as 10 meters above the surrounding land. To live beside it was to live beneath suspended water, trusting in earth walls against inevitability. The mystery lies in human adaptation. How did communities endure centuries of such instability? Archaeological layers in the floodplain show villages repeatedly rebuilt, fields resettled, dikes repaired. People did not abandon the plain because the low soils were too fertile, the water too necessary. Instead, they developed collective systems of labor for flood control, binding society itself to the rhythms of the river. Was the persistence of mythic flood imagery chaos overcome by order, an echo of this constant negotiation? It seems plausible, though direct proof remains elusive. An academic hypothesis considers the role of ritual in maintaining this balance. Sacrifices to river gods, described in early texts, may reflect communal attempts to secure stability in the face of uncontrollable floods. In this sense, myth becomes not just memory but practice, a way of reinforcing social cohesion in times of inundation. Flood legends thus carry both historical resonance and ritual power, binding ecological reality to spiritual necessity. The voice turns to images of sediment again. Each flood spreads loess-laden water across the plain, leaving behind a thin layer of clay. Over generations, these layers accumulate into a silent history beneath villages. Archaeologists uncover houses sealed by silt, pottery half buried in clay, hearths preserved in flood strata. These layers resemble varves in lakes or terraces in coral, each marking a season when the river rose too high. In them lies the geological counterpart of the stories told by survivors. The river's reputation as China's sorrow is balanced by its role as Mother River. The silt it spreads fertilizes fields, supporting populations that gave rise to Chinese civilization. Without floods, there would be no abundance. Without abundance, no cities. Without cities, no dynasties. Thus, grief and gift are inseparable. Myths of great floods are not only warnings, but acknowledgements of dependence. They remind that what sustains can also destroy. A gentle analogy forms. The Yellow River is like a great painter whose brushstrokes are unpredictable. Each season it sketches new channels across the plain, erasing old lines and drawing new ones. To live beside it is to accept that the map itself is temporary, that permanence lies only in change. Communities turned this unpredictability into stories of divine floods, taming heroes, and cosmic renewal. The voice gathers these threads into a quiet image. Along the banks of the Yellow River, villages rise and fall. Floodwaters sweep through lanes, then recede, leaving behind fertile silt. Children grow up hearing stories of you the Great, of gods appeased, of floods survived. Archaeologists, centuries later, find layers of clay, confirming that such waters did come. Myth and sediment converge, not in exactitude, but in resonance. The river remains both sorrow and mother, both destroyer and giver, both fact and legend. The voice lets the scene rest. The Yellow River continues its restless journey, shifting, rising, falling, defying complete control. Its floods inspire stories that outlast walls of earth, traveling across dynasties and into memory. In this way, the myths of deluge are not inventions, but the natural language of life lived beside a river that never stays the same. The voice now drifts southward, toward a sea that has long been framed as cradle and corridor, where islands and peninsulas scatter like stepping stones. The Mediterranean, bounded by mountains and desert, has not always been the tranquil inland sea we know today. Its floor holds memories of extremes, times when water drained away, leaving a salt desert, and times when floods poured back in, restoring a sea. To imagine the Mediterranean only as continuity is to overlook its history of drowning and rebirth, of silence and sudden sound. A factual anchor steadies this vision. Roughly 6 million years ago, during the late Miocene, the Mediterranean experienced what geologists call the Messinian salinity crisis. Tectonic shifts at the Strait of Gibraltar restricted inflow from the Atlantic, and evaporation exceeded river supply. Over several 100,000 years, the basin partially dried, leaving deposits of salt and gypsum kilometers thick across the seafloor. Fossil shorelines hundreds of meters below present sea level show where rivers carved canyons into exposed shelves. Later, about 5.33 million years ago, the Zanclean flood reopened Gibraltar, refilling the basin in what may have been one of the greatest floods in Earth's history. The Mediterranean has carried this layered memory ever since. A poetic detail rests in the remnants of those vanished rivers. The Nile, for example, deepened its valley by more than a kilometer during the Messinian lowstand, cutting a gorge beneath what is now Cairo. Today, that gorge lies buried beneath younger sediments, invisible to the eye but present in seismic surveys. The Rhone, the Po, and other rivers likewise carved canyons that now sleep below deltaic deposits. These silent, buried landscapes suggest a time when walking from Africa to Europe might have been possible across dried expanses. They remind that seas are not eternal. They can vanish, leaving scars in stone. Uncertainty lingers around the pace of the Zanclean flood. Some models propose that once Atlantic waters breached Gibraltar, the Mediterranean filled catastrophically, rising hundreds of meters in less than 2 years. A deluge on a planetary scale. Other reconstructions suggest a slower process, unfolding over decades or centuries. The geological evidence is ambiguous. Eroded channels at Gibraltar hint at rapid outflow, but thick sediment wedges in the basin suggest more gradual accumulation. Did the sea roar back in torrents or creep steadily upward? The record allows both, and the silence of the interval prevents final resolution. An academic hypothesis builds from this ambiguity. Some researchers argue that if the flood was indeed catastrophic, it may have been one of the most powerful erosional events in Earth's history, carving a canyon at Gibraltar several hundred meters deep. Others caution that this scenario may exaggerate, and that hydrodynamic models favor a moderated pace of inflow constrained by hydraulic geometry. Both interpretations rest on careful data, yet neither commands consensus. The Mediterranean's rebirth remains partly veiled, a story told in thick salt layers and buried valleys, but not yet fully revealed. The voice pauses to consider how much later human memory might retain echoes of such ancient events. 6 million years lie far beyond the span of cultural story, yet the Mediterranean has also known more recent floods. During the late Pleistocene and Holocene, sea level rose with melting ice, transgressing into lowlands and submerging coastal plains. Archaeological sites now lie beneath its waters, Neolithic villages drowned as the sea advanced. Fishermen's nets still catch fragments of worked stone or pottery from these submerged landscapes. It is here, in these younger shifts, that legend might intertwine with geology. A lesser-known detail emerges from the Aegean. On islands such as Crete and Santorini, oral traditions tell of ancient cataclysms, of seas overwhelming coasts, of islands breaking apart. Some of these may echo real events, such as the eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE, which unleashed tsunamis across the Aegean. Though distinct from the slower rise of sea level, such tsunamis blend into the larger theme: water overwhelming land, leaving stories of sudden ruin. The Aegean's myths of Poseidon's wrath or Atlantis's submergence may be more poetic than precise, yet they thrive in a region where seas have repeatedly reshaped coasts. Mystery persists in how collective memory stitches different waters into single narratives. Did stories of floods in the Mediterranean originate from tsunamis, from river deltas overwhelmed by rising seas, from storm surges, or from whispers of older geological convulsions like the Messinian? Myths blur these distinctions, carrying the essence of overwhelming water without regard to source. The Zanclean flood may lie beyond memory, but its pattern emptiness followed by deluge finds resonance in stories repeated through time. An academic hypothesis sometimes proposed suggests that the enduring fascination with Atlantis, first written by Plato, may have roots in folk memories of Bronze Age catastrophes, such as the Thera eruption. Though not universally accepted, the theory demonstrates how geological events and cultural imagination intertwine. Atlantis is not a preserved history of the Messinian, yet its motif of a drowned land echoes the broader Mediterranean legacy of vanishing and returning seas. The voice contemplates the salt layers beneath the basin. These evaporites, hundreds of meters thick, are mined today for geological insight. Within them are microscopic fossils of brine-adapted organisms, survivors of hypersaline pools. These fossils tell of a time when the Mediterranean was more saltpan than sea. The rock itself is memory, crystallized water, each crystal a page in the diary of evaporation. To look at them is to hold the ghost of vanished oceans. A quiet analogy surfaces. The Mediterranean's history is like a theater that is sometimes empty and sometimes full. When the curtain falls, the stage is bare rock and dust, actors gone. When the curtain rises, water pours in, filling the hall with sound and life. Audiences change, but the stage remains the same, capable of both silence and roar. Legends of floods are like echoes from past performances, lingering in the rafters long after the play has ended. The voice gathers small images, fishermen hauling nets with shards of Neolithic pottery from submerged settlements, divers tracing walls of stone roads now 20 meters underwater, seismic maps revealing drowned canyons cut by ancient rivers, salt domes beneath the seafloor rising like hidden mountains of memory. Each image belongs to the larger rhythm of water's absence and return. The mystery deepens when considering how much of this deep geological past might shape human imagination indirectly. Even if no culture directly remembered the Messinian, the landscape it left, deep valleys, steep gorges, unusual terraces, would have influenced later rivers and coastlines. Myths do not need to record events literally. They can arise from living in landscapes sculpted by ancient floods. In this sense, the Mediterranean's legends of submergence may be faint aftershocks of ancient cataclysms, mediated by terrain as much as by tale. The voice turns back to the present sea, blue and calm on the surface, layered with stories beneath. Its coasts are lined with ruins, ports now stranded inland by silt, harbors sunk below the tide, temples toppled by waves. Each ruin speaks of changing water, of land neither wholly stable nor wholly lost. For those who lived along its edges, floods were not hypothetical but real, whether in the form of slow sea rise, sudden tsunami, or river backflow. Legends, then, are natural companions to such a sea. The meditation rests with the image of the Mediterranean as a memory basin, holding within its depths the traces of vanished rivers, thick salt deserts, and ancient floods. Some stories born here belong to geology millions of years old, far beyond human time. Others belong to villages drowned a few thousand years ago, within reach of memory. All belong to the same theme: water retreating, water returning, water shaping both stone and story. The voice now drifts north, to a grey sea shallower than its name suggests. The North Sea, restless under shifting winds and tides, hides beneath its waves a drowned world once broad and green. Between Britain and continental Europe stretched a low plain, known to archaeologists as Doggerland, a land of rivers, marshes, and lakes, home to animals and people during the last ice age and long after. Today, only sandbanks and shoals remain, but beneath them lies the memory of a vanished country, erased not by sudden catastrophe alone, but by the slow rise of seas and the steady encroachment of water. A factual anchor steadies this meditation. During the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, sea level stood more than 100 meters lower than today. The English Channel was dry, the North Sea basin a wide plain linking Britain to Europe. As ice retreated and oceans rose, water gradually drowned this land. By about 8,000 years ago, only scattered islands remained. By 6,000 years ago, the rising tide completed the separation of Britain. Geological cores from the seabed reveal ancient soils, tree stumps, and peat layers overlain by marine sands, evidence of forests and wetlands replaced by sea. A poetic detail lingers in the name itself. Doggerland, taken from Dogger Bank, a shallow sandbar where fishermen for centuries have trawled up not only fish, but bones of mammoth, antler of elk, flint tools shaped by human hands. Nets, returning with both cod and carved spear points, give tangible proof of a land once walked upon. Each artifact lifted from the seafloor is a whisper of vanished fields, a trace of human presence where now only waves roll. Uncertainty surrounds the manner of Doggerland's final disappearance. Was it lost gradually, generation by generation, as tides advanced into marshes and estuaries, or did sudden events punctuate the retreat, forcing abrupt abandonment? One candidate is the Storiga Slide, a massive submarine landslide off Norway around 8,200 years ago that triggered tsunamis across the North Atlantic. Sediment deposits in Scotland and elsewhere record floodwaters surging inland. If Doggerland still existed as low-lying marsh and lagoon at that time, it may have been devastated by such a wave. Yet even without catastrophe, the rising sea would have consumed it in due course. An academic hypothesis suggests that the memory of Doggerland's loss may linger in European flood myths, perhaps contributing to stories of lands swallowed by the sea. Folklore from the British Isles and the Low Countries tells of sunken kingdoms, drowned cities, and bells that can still be heard ringing beneath the waves. While direct connections are impossible to prove, the parallels are striking. Real landscapes drowned, oral traditions of loss preserved. Doggerland offers a plausible setting where myth and geology converge. The voice considers the ecology of the lost land. Pollen records show birch and pine forests, grasslands where deer grazed, wetlands frequented by waterfowl, rivers braided through the plain, joining in estuaries that opened into the Atlantic. Human groups hunted, fished, and gathered along these waterways. Archaeological finds on the margins, microlith tools, hearth remains, fish traps suggest a rich cultural landscape. As water advanced, people must have followed the receding edges, abandoning settlements, resettling higher ground, always aware of the slow encroachment. A smaller detail emerges from seismic surveys of the seabed. Scientists mapping the subsurface for oil and gas exploration discovered buried river valleys, lake basins, and even possible dune fields beneath marine sediments. These maps reveal Doggerland not as a vague notion, but as a structured landscape, complete with watersheds and wetlands. Though unseen today, its topography remains imprinted in the earth, a ghost geography beneath the waves. The mystery lies in human perception. How did communities experience the drowning of their land? Was the advance of water fast enough to be remembered as disaster, or slow enough to seem ordinary? Oral tradition often preserves events of suddenness, a flood, a storm, a single season of loss. Yet archaeology suggests Doggerland vanished over millennia, perhaps its final low marshes, struck by tsunami or storm surge, gave a hinge for memory, crystallizing long attrition into one story of sudden submergence. An academic hypothesis extends this idea, that myths of Atlantis, though composed by Plato in Greece millennia later, reflect a recurring cultural motif of drowned lands, one that could be fueled by memories like Doggerland's loss. While Atlantis is not Doggerland, both share the theme of a fertile land swallowed by the sea. The persistence of such stories across cultures suggests that real drownings of coasts and plains left a mark in imagination as well as in geology. The voice gathers smaller images to rest the mind. A hunter walking across tundra grassland, where today ferries cross from Denmark to Britain. Children watching as tidal creeks expand year by year into estuaries. Fishermen hauling nets heavy not only with cod but with ancient bones, puzzled by relics of animals no longer alive. Divers descending to peat beds preserved beneath sand, touching the roots of trees that once stood in daylight. Each image ties human presence to geological change. A gentle analogy offers perspective. The loss of Doggerland is like watching a shoreline retreat into fog. At first, the change is barely noticeable. A step backward here. A marsh where there was once a field. Then the fog thickens. The familiar path is gone. The horizon erases, and soon the land itself is only a memory. The ocean does not rush, but drifts steadily forward, until all that remains is water reflecting sky. The voice returns to the Storiga slide. The possible punctuation of this story. Around 8,200 years ago, sediments on the Norwegian continental slope collapsed, releasing a mass of earth into the sea. The resulting tsunami raced across the North Atlantic, inundating coasts of Scotland, the Shetland Islands, and perhaps Doggerland itself. Deposits of sand within peat layers in Shetland testify to waves meters high sweeping far inland. If Doggerland was already low-lying marshland at that time, the tsunami could have obliterated settlements, leaving survivors to flee permanently. Whether remembered in legend or not, such an event would have marked a traumatic end for the people of the plain. The mystery persists. No written accounts exist, only sediments, bones, and folklore from much later ages. Stories from the Orkney Islands speak of land lost to the sea, bells ringing beneath waves. Tales from the Low Countries recall drowned churches and fields beneath water. These may be metaphors, or they may faintly echo real landscapes consumed by the rising North Sea. Memory and geology meet in uncertainty, each lending plausibility to the other. The voice lets the final image settle. The North Sea today is choppy, shallow, windswept, filled with trawlers and turbines. Yet beneath its floor lie forests and rivers, homes and hearths, tools and bones. Doggerland endures invisibly, a lost country that shaped migration, memory, and perhaps myth. Its drowning is both fact and story. One of the many reminders that land and sea trade places, and that humans live always at the edge of change. The voice moves to colder latitudes, where ice and sea have long contested one another for dominion. Between Asia and North America lies a narrow strait, now filled with grey water and shifting currents. Beneath that strait lies a memory. The Bering Land Bridge, a vast expanse of tundra steppe that once joined Siberia to Alaska. Known to scientists as Beringia, this region was not merely a corridor but a world of its own, sustaining grasses, mammoths, and people for thousands of years before the sea reclaimed it. Today only islands and shoals remain, yet the submerged shelf still records its ancient exposure in soils, sediments, and bones. A factual center steadies the vision. During the last glacial maximum, sea level was more than 100 meters lower than today, exposing the Bering Shelf as a landmass up to 1,000 kilometers wide. For millennia, this bridge connected continents, allowing humans, animals, and plants to disperse across. Archaeological evidence, combined with genetic studies, suggests that human groups entered Beringia from Siberia and remained there for thousands of years, some venturing into the Americas when ice sheets retreated. Around 11,000 years ago, rising seas submerged the bridge, isolating populations on either side and severing a path that had existed for ages. A poetic detail rests in the frozen soils of Beringia. Permafrost, laid down in glacial times, still preserves the bodies of mammoths and bison, hair and flesh intact after tens of thousands of years. Hunters crossing the land bridge would have seen herds on wide, dry plains, where walrus and whales now swim. In the silence of modern tundra, these creatures remain, sleeping in ice, reminders of a time when continents were joined by a green corridor. Uncertainty lingers in the timing and route of the first human migrations into the Americas. Some models suggest people moved south along the Pacific coast before inland ice corridors opened. Others propose that groups remained in Beringia for millennia, in what scholars call a Beringian standstill, isolated until conditions allowed dispersal. Archaeological sites from Alaska to Chile provide fragmentary evidence, but the precise sequence remains unsettled. The land bridge itself is gone, drowned, so direct proof of early camps and tools lies buried beneath the sea. An academic hypothesis proposes that oral traditions of indigenous peoples in Alaska and Siberia may contain memories of a time when land extended farther, when islands were part of a wider plain. Stories of ancestors crossing dry ground where now lies ocean might echo faintly from this period. Scholars treat such suggestions with caution, for stories transform over millennia, but the possibility remains. Myth as a long echo of vanished land. The voice turns to the physics of sea level again. As the great ice sheets melted, seas rose not evenly, but with regional variations shaped by gravity, crustal rebound, and ocean currents. In the Bering Strait, the threshold for submergence lies only about 50 meters below modern sea level. Once global seas rose past that lip, water poured in, flooding the low-lying corridor. By about 11,000 years ago, the bridge was largely submerged, though islands lingered as stepping stones for a time. The process was not instantaneous, but its effects were profound. Populations once continuous became separated. Migrations redirected. Ecosystems drowned. A small detail emerges from the Diomede Islands, lying midway between Siberia and Alaska. Today they are two rocky outcrops separated by a narrow channel, divided politically between Russia and the United States. But during glacial lowstands, they stood as hills within a continuous plain. The people who once walked across would not have needed boats. The islands are remnants of a world now hidden, quiet markers of the land beneath. The mystery extends to climate. Beringia, during the Ice Age, was not frozen wasteland, but dry grassland, part of the mammoth steppe that stretched across Eurasia and North America. Pollen records show sagebrush, grasses, and sedges, not forests or glaciers. For humans, this was habitable land, a place to hunt and gather. The stereotype of ice bridge misleads. It was instead a broad tundra with rivers, lakes, and rolling hills. That such a world could vanish beneath grey water is a reminder of the scale of sea level rise. An academic hypothesis considers how the submergence of Beringia influenced cultural divergence. Once the land was lost, groups on either side of the strait evolved separately, languages branching, traditions diverging. The sea became not a bridge, but a barrier, its storms and currents restricting movement. What had been unity became separation. The transformation of geography thus shaped human diversity. Not just human roots, the voice lingers on images of present-day currents. The Bering Strait today funnels water from the Pacific into the Arctic, influencing global circulation. Yet 10,000 years ago, that exchange was blocked. The Arctic was more isolated, its ecosystems different. The opening of the strait altered not only human movement, but also planetary systems of heat and salt. Thus, a drowned plain continues to influence climate long after it vanished. A poetic analogy arises. The Bering Land Bridge was like a slow breath held between continents. For tens of thousands of years the breath was steady, the land exposed. Then, as seas rose, the breath was released. The plain exhaled into ocean, the continents parted once more. People carried memory across the last steps, but the land itself slipped back beneath water, as if inhaled by the sea. The voice gathers quieter images. Hunters moving with herds across grassy plains now drowned. A child following a stream that today is a submarine channel. Fires built near lakes that lie buried beneath sediments of the seafloor. Bones of mammoth and muskox mingled with shells of clams in dredged sediments. Artifacts of two worlds, land and sea, merged. Each fragment testifies to a threshold crossed, a world changed. The mystery remains. How much of this drowned land survives in story? Archaeology cannot easily reach the seafloor at such depths. Myth, though mutable, sometimes carries landscapes long vanished. Perhaps stories of land lost to the sea, told among circumpolar peoples, echo faintly from Beringia's retreat. Or perhaps they arise from more recent coastal changes. The line between these possibilities is blurred, like the shifting shoreline itself. The voice quiets as it lets the image settle. The Bering Strait today, cold and stormy, where grey seas churn between continents. Beneath them lie soils, rivers, and camps of a world that once was. The bridge that connected worlds is gone, but its memory lingers in bones, sediments, and perhaps in story. Beringia is both fact and absence, a reminder that continents themselves are temporary, their shapes mutable with the tide of ice and sea. The voice moves far into the Pacific, where the ocean is not boundary but homeland, and islands appear like stars across water. Here, memory is not stored in clay tablets or stone monuments, but in songs, genealogies, and place names repeated by generations of navigators. Oral traditions in Oceania speak often of floods, of lands lost to the sea, of ancestors who sailed when shorelines changed. Across the vast ocean, stories of rising water accompany the lived experience of people who have always dwelled at the margin between sea and land. A factual foundation steadies this scene. Archaeological and geological evidence shows that sea level in the Pacific rose significantly after the last ice age, stabilizing only around 6,000 years ago. During that rise, coastal settlements were abandoned, reefs drowned, and shorelines redrawn. More recently, localized tectonic activity and volcanic eruptions have also altered coasts abruptly. Oral traditions across Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia recall such changes. Islands split, villages swallowed, coastlines advanced inland. Modern research confirms that many Pacific myths correspond closely to real geological events, suggesting extraordinary continuity in oral memory. A poetic detail emerges from the chants of Micronesian navigators. They memorize the names of stars, islands, swells, and reefs, reciting them in a cadence that is both map and song. Some chants include places now beneath the sea, guiding voyages across landscapes no longer visible. To sing such a chant is to keep alive not only routes across water, but also memories of coasts altered or erased. The sea becomes a library, its waves carrying not oblivion but knowledge encoded in rhythm. Uncertainty lingers in the relationship between myth and event. Some traditions describe floods that cover entire islands, which may recall tsunamis triggered by submarine earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. Others speak of gradual loss, where ancestral villages are said to lie beneath lagoons or reefs. Geological cores sometimes confirm these accounts, revealing drowned soils beneath coral growth, yet the precision of correlation is difficult. Did storytellers preserve direct eyewitness accounts, or did they weave symbolic narratives of water's power? The boundary remains blurred. An academic hypothesis suggests that certain Polynesian stories, which describe canoes fleeing advancing seas, may preserve memory of rapid coastal transgression during the mid-Holocene. Researchers note that oral traditions in Oceania often include highly specific geographic detail, names of submerged reefs, shapes of vanished bays that would be unlikely to arise purely as metaphor. These may represent cultural encoding of environmental change, ensuring survival knowledge for descendants who would face similar challenges. Yet such claims remain debated, for stories evolve even as they endure. The voice lingers on small islands where legends of drowning are especially vivid. In the Solomon Islands, people tell of lands lost beneath waves, their outlines still visible in clear water. In Tuvalu and Kiribati, myths recall ancestors moving inland as seas rose, a theme painfully echoed today as modern sea level rise threatens the same atolls. In Hawaii, chants describe floods linked to the wrath of deities. But geological evidence shows real tsunami deposits along the coasts. The stories are neither purely literal nor purely metaphorical. They dwell in the liminal space where memory and meaning meet. A small but striking detail lies in the reef itself. Coral grows upward towards sunlight, and when sea level rises, reefs keep pace if growth is fast enough. But when the rise is too quick, corals drown, leaving terraces beneath the waves. These drowned reefs mark former shorelines, silent witnesses to rising seas. For island communities, such changes would be visible. Familiar reef flats submerged, fish habitats altered, coastlines reshaped. The reef thus carries both ecological and cultural memory. The mystery extends to long-distance voyaging. Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of kilometers, guided not by instruments but by memory of stars, currents, and swells. Some oral histories describe voyages to islands that no longer exist, perhaps submerged seamounts or eroded atolls. Are these stories vestiges of real journeys to lands since lost, or are they symbolic markers in a mental map of the ocean? The uncertainty remains, but the persistence of these tales suggests that people have long grappled with the ocean's shifting geography. An academic hypothesis proposes that flood traditions in Oceania serve as practical warnings, encoded in myth to help future generations recognize and survive disasters. By framing floods as acts of deities or ancestral forces, the stories ensure their transmission, embedding survival lessons in cultural forms. For example, tales of moving inland at signs of receding water align with what modern science knows of tsunami precursors. In this sense, myth is not only memory, but adaptive knowledge. The voice turns to images of daily life shaped by water. Canoes pulled onto beaches that later vanish beneath tides. Grave sites once on dry land, now standing in shallow lagoons. Agricultural fields salted by advancing seas, forcing migration inland. Each change is felt intimately, not abstractly. The ocean that provides fish and transport also takes land, a duality that pervades island existence. Flood myths are natural companions to such lives. A poetic analogy arises. Islands in the Pacific are like rafts upon a vast sea, rising and falling with tectonic and climatic rhythms. To live upon them is to accept impermanence, to know that land itself may drift, sink, or vanish. Myths of floods and drowned lands are not exaggerations, but acknowledgements of this reality. Framed in forms that endure through generations, the voice gathers smaller images from across the ocean. In the Marquesas, stories tell of valleys flooded by seas sent by gods. In Samoa, legends describe coastal villages engulfed by waves. In Aotearoa, Maori traditions speak of great inundations, their details varying but always emphasizing transformation by water. Archaeologists find supporting evidence in tsunami deposits, buried soils, and drowned forests. The alignment is not exact, but the resonance is strong. Uncertainty persists, however, in distinguishing myth from metaphor. Some traditions describe floods as punishment for human actions, linking environmental disaster with moral order. Others speak of cosmic battles, where seas overwhelm land as part of a larger drama. To modern readers, such elements complicate interpretation, yet within them may still lie kernels of historical truth, refracted through cultural lenses. The ambiguity is part of their endurance. The voice contemplates the future, where Pacific communities again face rising seas. Atolls threatened by climate change echo the ancient experiences preserved in myth. Some villages already relocate, just as ancestors once did. The persistence of flood stories across Oceania offers a reminder. Humans have lived with rising waters before, and while losses are real, adaptation and memory endure. The meditation rests with the image of a navigator at sea, reciting names of islands, reefs, and stars. Among the names are places now gone, submerged beneath the Pacific, yet to speak them keeps them alive, part of the map of memory. In this way, flood traditions are not only recollections of past loss, but also acts of preservation, ensuring that even vanished lands remain part of cultural geography. The voice turns inland now, away from coasts and seas, to high mountains where water is stored as ice and released in sudden torrents. In the Andes of South America, glaciers sit like white crowns above valleys, and lakes gather behind moraines of loose rock. These lakes look placid, but they are provisional, held in place by dams that can fail without warning. When they do, floods race down valleys, scouring soil, moving boulders, leaving scars for people living below. Such events are remembered as cataclysmic, folded into oral traditions that speak of waters swallowing villages and valleys. A factual anchor steadies the meditation. Glacial outburst floods, known as Jokulhlaups in northern regions and alluviones in the Andes, occur when lakes formed by retreating glaciers suddenly drain. In the Peruvian Andes alone, more than 30 such catastrophic floods have been documented in the 20th century, many caused by ice avalanches falling into lakes and overtopping natural dams. Geological evidence shows that such events have occurred for millennia, carving valleys, rearranging river courses, and depositing fans of boulders and mud. The pattern is not unique to modern warming. It has accompanied deglaciation throughout time. A poetic detail comes from the highland lakes themselves. Some are a startling turquoise, colored by suspended rock flower ground fine beneath glaciers. They sit in basins of bare rock, silent mirrors surrounded by peaks. In the stillness of morning they look eternal, but they are temporary features in landscapes shaped by ice. Communities build shrines beside them, leaving offerings of coca leaves and chicha, acknowledging the lakes as both life-giving and dangerous. The waters are sacred, but they are also feared. Uncertainty lingers in the relationship between these sudden floods and local traditions. Archaeologists find ruins of settlements abandoned after flood events, but direct links between specific disasters and surviving myths are difficult to establish. Some Quechua and Aymara stories describe lakes that rose up and drowned valleys, or waters unleashed by offended mountain spirits. Are these memories of actual outburst floods, or metaphorical teachings about respect for the high peaks? The ambiguity remains. Oral traditions blur the boundary between geological and spiritual truth. An academic hypothesis suggests that certain myths of the Andes may preserve cultural memory of Jokulhlaups. For instance, tales of a deluge sent by mountain deities when humans showed disrespect could encode the real danger of moraine-dammed lakes. The moral framing ensures the story's transmission, but beneath it may lie observational knowledge. Lakes do burst, floods do descend, villages must beware. If so, the myth serves both as cosmology and as hazard awareness, an ancient form of risk communication. The voice turns to larger floods of Andean prehistory. Geological studies reveal enormous paleolacs once dammed by glaciers in valleys of Peru and Bolivia. When these dams failed, floods discharged volumes rivaling the flow of Amazonian tributaries. Evidence lies in stranded shorelines, giant boulder fields, and wave-cut terraces. These are signatures of floods, far greater than anything in modern memory. Did people witness such events at the end of the last ice age? If so, their stories could have carried forward as myths of world-ending deluges. Yet the direct line between geology and memory remains faint, like a shadow on stone. A smaller, human-scale detail emerges in the Inca road system. Some paths are rerouted around scarred valleys where landslides and floods once ran. Engineers of the empire built retaining walls and drainage systems to protect against torrents descending from the highlands. The infrastructure itself embodies memory of floods, designed not from theory but from experience. The road is both a route and a record, carrying in its alignments the lessons of past disasters. The mystery extends to Lake Titicaca, a vast body of water perched high between Peru and Bolivia. Archaeological studies show that its shoreline has shifted dramatically over millennia, sometimes expanding into surrounding plains, sometimes shrinking. Oral traditions among Aymara peoples speak of floods and droughts tied to the lake's moods, of times when entire settlements were submerged. Geological cores confirm that water levels have oscillated greatly, but whether specific stories preserve these changes is uncertain. The coincidence of myth and evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. An academic hypothesis has been proposed, linking Andean flood myths with broader climate anomalies. Around 4,200 years ago, a global event brought widespread droughts and floods, recorded in ice cores, cave deposits, and lake sediments. In the Andes, glacier records show abrupt changes. Some scholars speculate that myths of deluge in this region could reflect cultural memory of these shifts, transformed into narratives of divine retribution. While the evidence is circumstantial, the possibility illustrates how myths may serve as cultural responses to environmental stress. The voice lingers on the imagery of highland floods. Imagine a sudden roar in a valley, a wall of water mixed with ice and rock, racing downward faster than horses can flee. Fields vanish, terraces collapse, villages are swept away. When the torrent subsides, boulders lie scattered across plains, houses buried, channels rearranged. Survivors rebuild, but the story remains. The mountain released its waters. The valley was drowned, retold. Such stories become myths of wrathful gods or vengeful lakes. A poetic analogy arises. A glacial lake is like a sealed vessel of glass resting on a shelf. As long as the shelf holds, the vessel seems safe. But if it tips, the contents pour out all at once. Moraine dams are shelves of loose stones, fragile under stress. They can hold for centuries and then collapse in a moment. For those who live below, the distinction between stability and catastrophe is as thin as a ridge of rock. The voice gathers images from across the range. At Huaraz in Peru, a 1941 outburst flood from Lake Palcacocha killed thousands, leaving the valley strewn with debris. At Chavin de Huantar, ancient temples bear signs of flood deposits, as if waters once surged through sacred precincts. In Chile, valleys carry boulder bars, hundreds of meters wide, left by prehistoric floods, whose magnitude dwarfs modern experience. Each site is a page in the book of water's force, recorded not only in geology but in memory and architecture. The mystery remains in the endurance of story. Some Andean myths speak of a great flood that ended a former age of humanity, after which the world was renewed. This mirrors patterns seen elsewhere in Mesopotamia, in the Pacific, in China. Did Andean peoples preserve an echo of late glacial floods? Or did the universality of water, as destroyer and renewer, give rise to similar myths independently? The question cannot be answered with finality. The voice rests with an image of twilight in the Andes. Glaciers glow pink with the last light. Lakes lie calm beneath peaks. Rivers murmur through terraces. Yet within that calm lies the potential for sudden flood. And within human culture lies memory of those floods, transformed into story. Here, too, myth and geology entwine. Water carving valleys, water shaping cosmologies. The voice turns now to a time of climate's sharp hesitation, when the world seemed poised to warm but was suddenly seized again by cold. This interval, called the Younger Dryas, begins about 12,900 years ago and endures for more than a millennium. It interrupts the long deglaciation that followed the Ice Age, a brief return to glacial conditions after warmth had already begun to spread. Ice advances again in mountains, winters sharpen, and ecosystems shift, as if the planet itself pauses in breath. The cause of this reversal remains one of the great mysteries of quaternary science, and within it lie suggestions of floods, disruptions, and cultural dislocations that may echo in ancient stories. A factual foundation steadies the reflection. Evidence from Greenland ice cores shows a sudden drop in temperature of around 4 to 8 degrees Celsius at the start of the Younger Dryas, recorded in oxygen isotopes. Across the northern hemisphere, pollen records confirm abrupt shifts. Forests retreat, tundra expands, steppe grasses return. In Europe, the period marks the reappearance of cold-adapted flora and fauna. In North America, the retreat of ice halts, and some glaciers advance again. The Younger Dryas is a global event, though most intense in the north, and it lasts until about 11,700 years ago, when temperatures rise just as abruptly as they had fallen. A poetic detail appears in the name itself. The period is called the Younger Dryas, after a small Arctic flower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen suddenly proliferates in European sediments of that age. The flower becomes emblem of the event, a delicate bloom standing for 1,000-year winter. In varves of Scandinavian lakes, the pollen appears in layers like thin strokes of a pen, each representing a summer when cold returned. That a single plant can symbolize planetary climate speaks to the quiet eloquence of natural archives. Uncertainty centers on the cause. One leading hypothesis proposes that meltwater from retreating ice sheets, particularly from proglacial Lake Agassiz in North America, suddenly drained into the North Atlantic, freshening the ocean surface and disrupting the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. With circulation weakened, heat transport from tropics to high latitudes faltered, plunging the north back into cold. Yet the precise routing of this meltwater, and whether it alone could trigger the global scale of changes, remains debated. Alternative hypotheses invoke different triggers: shifts in atmospheric circulation, changes in ice sheet dynamics, or even extraterrestrial impact. None alone satisfies all evidence, leaving the Younger Dryas enigmatic. An academic hypothesis that stirs both curiosity and controversy is the so-called Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Some researchers argue that fragments of a comet or asteroid exploded in the atmosphere or struck ice sheets, igniting wildfires, darkening skies, and destabilizing climate. They cite evidence of unusual deposits, microspherules, nanodiamonds, and layers of soot at sites across several continents. Others counter that these findings are inconsistent, contaminated, or better explained by terrestrial processes. The debate remains unresolved, a reminder that science is as much a process of questioning as of answering. The voice lingers on cultural implications. The Younger Dryas coincides with transitions in human societies. In the Near East, communities that had begun cultivating cereals in the Natufian culture appear to shift, perhaps driven by climatic stress, into new patterns that eventually lead to agriculture. Some scholars suggest that the cold, dry conditions of the Younger Dryas encouraged experimentation with domestication as wild resources dwindled. In North America, the event overlaps with the decline of the Clovis culture, marked by distinctive fluted spear points. Whether climate, overhunting, or other factors drove this decline is uncertain, but the coincidence is striking. A smaller detail hides in lake sediments of South America. Though the Younger Dryas is most prominent in the north, cores from tropical Andes lakes show signals of cooling and glacier advance at the same time. This suggests that the event's reach was global not local, shaping climates across hemispheres. Even in the Southern Ocean, shifts in upwelling and circulation correspond. The planet as a whole seemed to shudder in response to an unknown disturbance. The mystery extends to human memory. Could stories of sudden floods and world-changing cold preserve echoes of the Younger Dryas? If meltwater outbursts from Lake Agassiz or other reservoirs triggered oceanic disruption, the floods themselves would have been massive, scouring landscapes, carving channels, drowning plains. Such cataclysms could have impressed themselves on oral traditions, later translated into myths of deluge. Yet the timescales stretch deep. More than 12,000 years separate those events from the earliest recorded myths. Whether memory can extend so far remains uncertain, though recent research shows surprising longevity in some oral traditions tied to place. An academic hypothesis connects the Younger Dryas to megafaunal extinctions. In North America, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats vanish near this time. Some argue that abrupt climate change stressed ecosystems already pressured by human hunting, tipping species into extinction. Others hold that human overhunting alone suffices, or that diseases played a role. The Younger Dryas may have been one factor among many, a climatic jolt accelerating declines already underway. Still, the coincidence invites speculation that flood myths of vanished worlds may echo not only inundations of land, but the disappearance of animals once central to human life. The voice gathers quiet images, icebergs carving into seas, releasing torrents of fresh water, rivers reversing course as outlets shift, fires sweeping across tundra as climates flicker between dry and wet, communities adjusting to shorter growing seasons, storing seeds, migrating to better grounds, animals moving north and south, herds dwindling, hunters adapting. Each image is part of the tapestry of the Younger Dryas, stitched together from sediments, ice cores, and archaeological traces. A gentle analogy surfaces. The Younger Dryas is like a page in a book where the text suddenly reverses, words written backward for a time before resuming their forward script. Climate, which had been warming, suddenly runs in reverse, then abruptly resumes its course. To live through it would have been bewildering. Ancestors expecting warming fields, finding instead a return of cold, forests retreating, rivers freezing again. Myths of sudden reversal, of floods or cold that come without warning, may carry faint reflections of such lived bewilderment. The voice returns to Greenland's ice, where layers record the event in striking clarity. Each year's snowfall compacts into fern, then ice, preserving bubbles of ancient air. In these cores, the Younger Dryas appears as a sharp, thin band of altered chemistry, a sudden step in isotopes and trapped gases. To hold such a core in one's hands is to touch the memory of a planetary pause, a 1,000-year interruption written in frozen water. Yet, the cause remains unresolved. Meltwater pulses, impacts, circulation shifts, all hold partial truths, none complete. The Younger Dryas endures as a mystery in climate science, a reminder that even with modern data, not all past events are fully explained. Myths of floods and sudden change resonate with this mystery, for they too embody events remembered yet not fully understood. The meditation settles with an image of a flower, the Dryas, white petals spread against tundra. This fragile bloom names a planetary reversal, linking a plant's pollen to global climate. It is a symbol of the quiet power of archives, that something so small can represent something so vast. In the silence of ancient lakes and glaciers, the Younger Dryas waits, not as story, but as evidence. In the silence of myth, floods and reversals are told, not as data, but as meaning. Between them lies the possibility that human imagination has long carried fragments of a time when the world itself trembled. The voice turns finally toward echoes rather than events, toward the way memory persists across time. Layered like sediments in story, flood myths appear not in one place alone, but across the world, diverse in detail, yet similar in shape. Waters rise, land vanishes, a few survive, life renews. This repetition does not prove a single origin, yet it suggests a shared human recognition that water can both sustain and erase. Legends of floods are like refracted light, each culture shaping the prism differently, but all hinting at a common source of awe. A factual anchor steadies this meditation. Comparative mythology catalogues hundreds of flood narratives across continents. Mesopotamian epics, Vedic hymns of Manu, Chinese legends of Yu, Greek tales of Deucalion, Native American accounts from the Pacific Northwest, Polynesian traditions of drowned coasts. Anthropologists note that floods are among the most widespread mythic motifs, rivaled only by creation stories themselves. This ubiquity reflects both ecological reality, rivers flood, coasts transgress, lakes burst, and the symbolic power of water as agent of cleansing and renewal. Myths may not all descend from a single event, but they arise naturally wherever people live with water. A poetic detail appears in the way myths encode geography. Some stories preserve precise place names now beneath the sea, such as Polynesian chants that list drowned reefs, or Aboriginal Australian songlines that trace coastlines inundated more than 7,000 years ago. Linguists studying these traditions find remarkable stability in place names, suggesting oral continuity that may extend thousands of years. In this way, memory is not abstract, but anchored in landscape. Even when the landscape itself has vanished, uncertainty remains in measuring the longevity of oral tradition. Some scholars argue that myths can preserve memories of geological events for millennia, citing Aboriginal accounts of sea level rise after the last ice age. Others caution that oral traditions continually adapt, mixing memory with metaphor, making precise correlation uncertain. Are flood myths memories of real events, or archetypal stories arising independently? The truth may be both. Some myths carry historical kernels, others symbolic truths, most a blend of the two. An academic hypothesis emerges in the study of cultural transmission. Myths may spread along with trade, migration, and conquest, so that a flood story in one region may inspire or reshape another far away. The similarities between Mesopotamian, Hebrew, and Greek flood stories may reflect such diffusion, traveling along the networks of the ancient Near East. By contrast, flood stories in Oceania or the Americas may arise independently, inspired by local floods or rising seas. Thus, the global prevalence of flood myths is not proof of a single event, but of both shared experience and shared storytelling. The voice lingers on smaller images, each drawn from a different corner of the world. In the Andes, a story of lakes that burst when disrespected. In Japan, a tale of the sea rising to punish arrogance. In North America, narratives of canoes tied to mountaintops, survivors watching waters cover the land. In Scandinavia, myths of giants drowned by floods unleashed by gods. Each image carries local detail, but shares a common arc: survival through deluge, renewal after destruction. A poetic analogy surfaces. Flood myths are like rivers in floodplain country. Each channel wanders, braids, and diverges, yet in times of flood they converge into one sheet of water, spreading across the land. Myths likewise diverge in details but converge in theme, covering the cultural landscape with a shared image of overwhelming water. The voice turns to mystery. Why do humans so often imagine world-ending floods rather than fires, winds, or earthquakes? Part of the answer lies in ecology. Most early civilizations grew along rivers, where floods were regular and sometimes catastrophic. Another lies in psychology. Water cleanses, resets, restores. To imagine a flood is to imagine not only destruction but renewal. Thus, flood myths hold both dread and hope, a balance that explains their persistence. An academic hypothesis touches the threshold between memory and metaphor. Some scholars propose that even if myths begin as records of real floods, over generations, they acquire symbolic layers, becoming parables of morality, authority, or cosmic order. In Mesopotamia, floods justify new kingship. In India, they sanctify Manu as father of humanity. In China, they affirm Yu as founder of dynasty. The event, whatever its origin, becomes a cultural tool, a means of linking human order with natural power. The voice gathers evidence of how myths endure. Archaeological sites drowned by Holocene seas lie offshore from Britain, India, and Japan. In each case, local traditions recall lost lands. Fishermen describe hearing bells beneath the waves or finding stone walls underwater. Whether literal or symbolic, such tales show how communities process loss by framing it in story. The drowned land is not forgotten but given new life in myth, remaining present in imagination even when absent in geography. A small detail emerges from Aboriginal traditions in Australia. Along coasts now submerged, stories recount the drowning of landmarks that geological evidence confirms were lost 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. These traditions show continuity of memory across extraordinary spans of time. They suggest that under certain conditions, ritual repetition, deep cultural value, oral traditions, can indeed preserve real events for millennia. Such cases strengthen the idea that some flood myths may be memories of actual post-glacial inundations. The mystery deepens when considering the universality of myth. Are humans predisposed to imagine floods because they are archetypal symbols of chaos and renewal? Or do myths simply reflect lived experience, repeated independently across regions? Myths of fire, wind, or drought are also common. Yet floods seem to dominate. Perhaps it is because water is the element that most visibly shifts boundaries between land and sea, safety and danger, life and loss. Its capacity for transformation is unparalleled, making it the perfect metaphor for change. A poetic image lingers. Imagine storytellers gathered by fire, recounting how once the waters rose and covered all land. Listeners know that fields flood each spring, that storms surge each season. They nod, recognizing truth in the exaggeration. The story magnifies lived experience into cosmic narrative, ensuring its persistence. Over generations, the story becomes not just memory of one flood, but symbol of all floods. Universal in form, particular in detail, the voice softens toward rest. Legends of floods do not resolve into a single origin or explanation. They are layered, refracted, reshaped across time. Some hold echoes of real geological events, sea level rise, tsunamis, outburst floods. Others are symbolic, born from the rhythms of rivers and the cycles of agriculture. Together, they form a bridge between geological truth and cultural memory, between stone and story. The meditation settles with one final analogy. Myths are like sediments in a delta. Each flood deposits new layers, burying and preserving what came before. Over time, the delta grows, a composite of countless floods, each both real and remembered. To study flood myths is to read that delta, to trace the lines where geology and imagination meet. In their persistence, we find not proof of single events, but testimony to the deep entanglement of humans with water, to the way floods shape both land and thought. The voice eases now, no longer tracing rivers or seas, no longer naming floods or myths. Motion quiets. The long journey across ice and plain, across deltas and drowned lands, drifts into stillness. Water lies calm. Rivers no longer rush but rest in their beds. Seas no longer rise in sudden pulses but spread evenly, level, reflective. Glaciers glow faintly under stars, unmoving. Marshes exhale mist, slow and even, like the breath of a sleeping earth. There are no more causes to weigh, no more hypotheses to hold. Questions remain, but they are left unanswered, set gently down like stones in sand. The mystery of floods, of memory, of story, all dissolves into the wider quiet of time. In the darkness, landscapes sleep. Drowned valleys dream beneath the waves. Forests rest in silt. Clay tablets crumble back into earth. Coral terraces stand motionless, steps without climbers. Every archive closes, not in finality, but in rest. The voice slows until words themselves resemble sediment settling, layering, soft, without urgency. There is no need to follow further. The journey does not conclude. It simply comes to stillness. Here, silence spreads like water across plain. It carries no fear, no destruction, only rest. The planet is timeless, its changes too slow now to chase. All things fold into quiet. Rivers, seas, mountains, myths. The voice fades. Nothing remains but stillness, deep as sleep.